Welcome to Roil Road, where we ask the question, what road are we all on, and how do we navigate it? Today, Brian Martinez and I will be discussing why I opted early for a vaccine booster shot, America's growing distrust of legacy media, how that distrust opened the door for Donald Trump to make unsubstantiated claims about a stolen election, and more. But first, let me tell you about Roil. Roil is a better way to enjoy content online. You just tell Roil which internet content you like, such as YouTube channels, podcasts, and more, and then you can access them all from one place, the Roil app. It also uses content interconnection to break free from tech monopolies. Click the links below to learn more. Roil is just getting started, but it's going to be big. Be among the first to discover Roil. Now, let's get this show on the road. Brian Martinez, very good to see you again, as always. I hope you're well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking, John. How are you?
Brian, I feel good. I feel strong. I got my vaccine booster on Monday. I didn't feel so great Tuesday, but now I'm fine and I feel extra immune. So why don't I start off by talking about my vaccine story?
Sure.
Just so I'm not misunderstood, F the mandate. The vaccine should be a personal choice. It drives me crazy to see Biden saying, mandates work, we get 90-something% compliance. Oh, really? You discovered that brute force works. The same thing that every dictator ever would point to, like, what? It works. We force them and they comply or gulag. Yes, if you force people by taking away their jobs, 90-something% will comply. But that's not how you treat people. Anyway, back to my booster shot. As a bit of personal context, I used to have seasonal allergies. So I got the standard treatment for that, which is allergy shots, where they inject you with little bits of the things that you're allergic to, and that reprograms your immune system to eliminate your allergies. Basically, you get a shot once a month, and it makes your allergies go away, and after a few years, you're cured. So I went through that, and it was awesome because it fixed my allergies. Therefore, I was also very used to the idea that one of the miracles of medicine is that they can inject you with stuff and train your immune system to be better. Naturally, I started getting flu shots too, because it's an easy win. It feels great to know that you've made your body stronger, which, God, that's hard to do. If you try to do push-ups to really make your body stronger, you know how hard that is? But with a shot, it just takes a second and you walk away stronger. I love the feeling. But I also think part of the reason I was able to tap into that positivity is that I'd gone through the allergy shots, so I wasn't scared of needles anymore. How many people out there are just like, look, my life toolkit does not involve me voluntarily going somewhere and getting a shot. All I can say is that the feeling you get from knowing that you leveled up your immune system is golden. The last thing I want to say is about the idea that maybe there are side effects and how that concept just burrows into your brain and sticks there until you don't know up from down. Like everybody, I had heard rumors about the vaccine having long-term side effects. And it did play a mental trick on me. And here's how that went. For my fitness, I do high-intensity training. I exercise just about every day in a short time, high-intensity fashion where I use a chest strap heart monitor. And every day I write down what the highest heart rate is that I achieved. And I've been doing this for years, so I have lots of data. Well, after I got my 2 vaccination shots in the spring, I started noticing, hey, I'm not achieving the high numbers I used to achieve. For example, reaching 180 used to be pretty normal, but I noticed that my numbers were sliding so that now it was rare. And I got to thinking, man, maybe my athletic output took a long-term hit from the vaccine, like I had been hearing about people having side effects. So I decided to use Excel and plot my top rates over time, expecting to see a drop-off after the vaccine. I did the plot, and the data was totally clear. I knew the date of the vaccine. I had the records going back way before that. And the vaccine didn't change anything. There was a pre-existing downward trend you couldn't even see the vaccine on a graph. Now, as a side note, this led me to look for other causes. I learned that I have sleep apnea, which I'm now treating, and the numbers are moving back in the right direction. I know this is just a personal anecdote, but I think it's interesting how I absorbed the idea of long-term side effects, and it truly got into my head. I had to look at the hard data, which said, no, you're fine. It's so easy to fool yourself about what's going on with your body. Anyway, it's a long story short. I feel great. I got my booster shot, and I feel extra immune from it. So I'm feeling pretty good.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. And yeah, I mean, even if in the event that there could be, I just hope that you don't have to deal with any of those side effects. So, but what really matters, I think, in my opinion, is that number one, you're healthy, and number two, you chose to get the vaccine. So, and then the fact that you're in Florida, where it's being sort of treated like this very political football, especially with states like Florida. And now mine, Virginia, because I think that we're going to be going in the same direction. It's important to get all of that noise out of your head and just ask yourself, is this for me or not? And just act on that, because that's, I mean, I don't know. To me, it's a pretty simple question.
So we've got a great lineup of stories today. Up first is about the collapsing public confidence in the media. So we have this from The Hill. U.S. just finished dead last among 46 countries in media trust. Dead last. Ouch. The article says, the U.S. media is the least trustworthy in the world, according to a comprehensive new Reuters Institute survey encompassing 46 countries. Yes, you read that right. The country with among the most resources in this area, human, technical, and otherwise, finished dead last. Finland ranked the highest, with a 65% trust rating. In Kenya, the trust rating clocked in at 61%. But here in the USA, the home of global media giants including the New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN, the media is trusted by a whopping 29% of those reading and watching. 29%. So 71%, the vast majority of people, don't trust the media. They recognize something is up, something's wrong. Goes on to say, one example was an Axios and SurveyMonkey poll from 2019, which found that nearly 8 in 10 independent voters said they believe the news organizations report news, quote, they know to be fake, false, or purposely misleading, end quote. 92% of Republicans felt the same, as did even the majority of Democrats. So it's not a situation where merely the public thinks, hey, the media is careless, the media makes mistakes. There is a pervasive recognition today that the media is proceeding in a biased fashion. It's strong wording from a poll question. Fake, false, or purposefully misleading. Another thing that stood out to me was they're noting it wasn't always this way, later in the article. Back in 1976, in the days of anchors such as Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor, David Brinkley, and Roger Mudd, nearly 3/4 of the country trusted the media, according to Gallup. What is interesting to me, one of the things about that, is that's 1976. I don't know how familiar people are with history, but 76 was not a good time. It was not a peaceful time in our culture. The assassinations of the late 60s were just a few years in the past. Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, enormous civil unrest about that. The Vietnam War had just ended, massive civil unrest. Nixon had just stepped down over the Watergate controversy. And yet, despite so much conflict in the country, there was 3/4 support and trust in the media. It shows that back then, the media was serving as a glue to hold the country together in a very divisive time. Whereas today, it's like the centrifugal force pushing us apart. It's just such a stunning contrast.
Yeah, exactly right. I think that we often don't recognize just how important a good media is, because people in general, they want to do what they think is best for their community, for their country, for their neighbors, their fellow man. And they can't do that unless they know what the issues are, unless they are as close to the truth as possible. You know, it's like, and I could relate this to men in that, you know, men like to fix problems, but they want to know what the problems are, right? So you can't just talk about, oh, there's a leaky pipe and, you know, just sort of go on and on about that without saying, can you please fix the pipe? Which, of course, you know, they'd have to investigate, find out what the problem is, and then take care of the problem. So what news media is supposed to do is I know that it's not easy for people to be objective, but I think it's entirely possible. So they should be objective as humanly possible. They should tell us what's going on, you know, give us the facts, and then let us as people decide what we think about that. And because, you know, you mentioned Watergate, and there have been controversies that should have been far more, let's say, should have been far more impactful, or that took place, than Watergate. But back then, Watergate was like the big thing that happened, right? Everybody was up in arms over it. Like, it wasn't even, I don't even think too many people were all that divided on it, because they were like, well, yeah, this is wrong. This shouldn't be happening. And so since then, we've had lots of things that are basically like Watergate times, you know, 10 times 20 times 100. And again, on both sides. So this isn't a political thing. I'm not making a partisan case here. And yet either the media doesn't spend enough time on it, or you know, it gets memory hold, or we get distracted with something else, and all of a sudden we forget that this important thing happened. And when people are constantly being bombarded with things that are either minimizing the importance of a given story or magnifying the, you know, smallness of another story, you know, so like the focus is altered, and people are good. So what happens is people say, well, I'm going to try and find my news somewhere else, or I'm going to look for more information on this thing that CNN isn't telling me about. And then they find alternative media, which is the new thing that's blowing up right now. And mainly it's because trust in our mainstream media is not enough. And so, but the side effect of alternative media, unfortunately, is that for all of the hard work that these independent journalists do, or independent commentators that aren't part of one of these gigantic conglomerates, you know, is that they essentially bring about, first of all, they're open to being wrong too. So this creates, you know, some more room for error. But even when they're right, the issue is that now we have at least probably, you know, we have a number of segments of the population that are looking at the same story, and they all have different info. And so because they have different information, then when they want to, you know, talk to their friends or family about it, there's nothing that unifies. It's just like you said, right? So imagine Walter Cronkite reporting on Watergate in the 1970s or the 1960s when it happened. Everybody was tuned in. Everybody was on the same page. Everybody had the same info, even if they were watching a different news station that might have a slightly different, you know, skew, whether it skews right or skews left or whatever. But they at least are all working with the same data, and then they can discuss that, you know, with their neighbors, with their family members, etc. And at the very least, you knew that everyone was on the same page, even if they disagreed. But with the way things are now, there's literally like people who are just concealing info, hiding it from other people because it doesn't suit some narrative, or because, it's not convenient, or whatever it is, right? And then you have independent journalists that they're not beholden to anyone. They do whatever it is they think is right. For example, Project Veritas is a good example of that. And regardless of how you feel about them, they are bringing something to the fore that shouldn't be thrown out. And so you end up in a situation where there are some people working with some kinds of info and others working with others, and they can't talk to each other because they believe the other person is lying because they also don't trust the media. So it's like this, sick kind of cycle of what's the truth. And I think that in a way, I believe that not being able to identify the truth clearly is it's the point in a way, because if everyone's confused and they don't know what's true, then they start to become demoralized by that, because it's like, well, I don't know if any of this is true. I think I'm just going to go watch my sports ball, or, engage in this other diversion over here, because I don't, and I can't talk about it on social media because there are fact checkers, and, so it's like this war on the potential to seek out the truth. I wouldn't even say on the truth itself, but people's desire or ability to go and find it, and they're not getting it from the media. So not a surprise. One
thing that I've noticed just talking to friends of mine is there's this shift towards, you'll bring up some story. Oh, did you hear such and such happen? And then they'll instantly be like, that sounds like an other side thing. Where did you see that? Oh, you saw that here. No, that's an other side thing. I'm not into that. And it's like, wait a minute. Are you saying you don't believe it? Or are you saying that it's just, that doesn't work it's not relevant within the umbrella of what you're willing to consider? They're like, no, it has to be vetted through the good people side. That can't become, I don't pay attention to facts coming from the bad people side. And it's really weird to see people choosing to put themselves in boxes like that.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of it, but I think that in a way there is a lot of coercion to put people, like the way that I've seen the media work, and again, I'm speaking in broad terms, is they basically say, here are the facts that we have. If you believe in truth and facts, then you're in this box with us with the facts. And then there's other media outlets that say the same thing about their side. And so people put themselves in those boxes because it's more about like, well, I want to believe the right things that all the other people believe. And so they're made to feel as though, well, this is what the majority of the country thinks, or this is what the majority of the West thinks. Are you with this or not? And so people, because they just want to fit in, they just go ahead and join in. And a lot of times I think they kind of convince themselves like, well, this must be the truth because look at all these people that are, sharing it online or that claim to believe it as well. And, I think that part of this is also because we have, for whatever reason, we have been moving more and more towards a morally relativist, subjective way of seeing the world. Like however you think it is how it is to you. And I've been, pushing back on that pretty hard. Because people, yes, you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. We have to determine what they are. And if someone isn't, if you don't feel like you're getting the whole story, then you shouldn't necessarily form a rock solid opinion on it because you don't have everything at your disposal. So be open to the possibility of being wrong or ignorant on something.
Well, that's a great transition to get us to the next story, which is Trump's letter to the editor of the Wall Street Journal. So here we go with a case where it would be really nice to have a credible media. As you were talking about just before, where nobody knows what the truth is, that's sort of a postmodernist concept, and I hate postmodernism. Postmodernism is the idea that there isn't any single big T truth, it's just your truth and my truth and that guy's truth. Ugh. And as much as I hate postmodernism, as we were just talking about, it does seem to be that the rules of today's internet/media environment are postmodern. Damn. So here we have former President Trump in a letter to the editor of the Wall Street Journal sharing his quote unquote truth about the 2020 election. And his strategy is to push a bunch of unsubstantiated claims to the point where people think if he's blowing this much smoke, then there must be fire. In the letter, he rattles off basically every rumor that's ever circulated on the internet about the 2020 election with the tone very much, I'm going to make 100 accusations, and unless you prove every one of them false, I win. Of course, that's not how the burden of proof should work. There's an old saying that you can't prove a negative. But Trump's quote-unquote truth is that if you don't prove a negative on everything he lists off, then that means that he wins. Now, the editors of the Wall Street Journal did a response to Trump's letter. And I think that they covered it quite nicely. So what they wrote is that Mr. Trump's letter is his familiar barrage with 20 bullet points about alleged irregularities that he said proved the election was rigged. It's difficult to respond to everything, and the asymmetry of that is part of the former president's strategy. He tosses up enough unsourced numbers in 30 seconds to keep a fact checker busy for 30 days. When one claim is refuted, Mr. Trump is back with two more. To highlight a few, Trump objects to the way the Pennsylvania Supreme Court rewrote the deadline for mail ballots. The Journal notes that they objected to that too, but Trump insinuates that the presidential results include thousands of tardy votes and that none of those votes should have been counted. The fact is, they weren't, per a directive from Justice Samuel Alito. Those ballots were segregated as the court had ordered, according to a spokesman from the Pennsylvania Department of State, and they are not included in the vote totals. Mr. Trump also says, quote, 25,000 ballots were requested from nursing homes at the exact same time, end quote. His citation for this is a November 9th cable TV spot by Senator Lindsey Graham. And Mr. Trump is alleging 25,000 fake votes in Pennsylvania based on this stray remark that Graham made in this interview, the South Carolina Graham. Breaking news, the Journal writes, a politician on TV was repeating a rumor. Now, the Wall Street Journal says that they emailed to follow up Graham's office, and Graham's office said, quote, it's an allegation, one of many others, but it can now be laid to rest. So, in other words, Lindsey Graham was on TV November 9th of 2020, musing about some rumor he had heard about 25,000 fake votes. The facts did not materialize to substantiate that. Lindsey Graham admits that no, that wasn't backed up, but yet still here a year later, Trump is listing this as among his bill of particulars for why the election was stolen. The editorialists continue to write, this is how it goes for election truthers. First, the allegation was ballots marked with Sharpies. Then, voting machines tied to Venezuela. Then, more votes than voters. Now, Mr. Trump apparently thinks his own attorney general did an inside job. Electoral fraud does happen. A Pennsylvania man received 5 years of probation this spring for voting for Mr. Trump on behalf of his dead mother. The price of liberty, they say, is vigilance, but the evidence doesn't show anything real that could dent Pennsylvania's 80,555 vote margin. This is, to me, a great point. Trump scattershots allegations of cheating. 9 of those allegations get disproven, right? What happened to the Sharpies? What happened to the voting machines in Venezuela? Oh, those are all debunked? And yet somehow whatever remains until it gets completely disproven means that the election was stolen? The point the journal's editors are making is that Trump's claims are undemonstrated. And I repeat that from my heart. The stolen election claim is undemonstrated. I've sincerely looked for evidence and I don't find it. It's not there. If the evidence was out there, then it wouldn't be hard to find. The word evidence does not mean you haven't proved everything Trump said false. The burden of proof is to show that the election was stolen, not the other way around. In order to believe Trump's quote-unquote truth, you would have to believe that all the people around him were part of a conspiracy against him. All the justices that he himself appointed to the Supreme Court, the Attorney General that he appointed, Mike Pence, who was loyal to him throughout his term. As we're taping right now in November 2021, there were just Republican victories in elections nationwide. Hey, those weren't stolen. I guess you also have to believe that they only steal from Trump. Even Trump's most fervent supporters know that his chief virtue is not honesty 100% of the time. This is a man who can tell a lie. And I don't want to come across as overexcited, but what he did in refusing to accept the election result was a betrayal. The thing that made America great in the first place was when George Washington voluntarily left the presidency. A lot of good people supported Trump. His supporters had given him the benefit of the doubt that, sure, he might act erratic sometimes, but he's not going to do anything actually crazy. He betrayed those supporters, and they need to see it for what it is, a betrayal. And it just breaks my heart that people are clinging to Trump and thereby preventing anything new from emerging. I feel like the country needs to start talking about this now, instead of sleepwalking towards some inevitability of Trump winning the Republican primary in 2024. And that's just where I stand on it.
Fair enough. I mean, I don't have much else to add. I think we talked a little bit about it, before the show. I said that if election confidence for the average citizen is very important. If they don't feel like their vote matters, then I think it's going to create real problems. It's basically part of I don't want to get a little too, well, I might have to get a little esoteric, but it's a part of the logos, right? So the logos is basically our ability to hash out ideas, and we do it through talking. But one of the other ways that people do it is with their vote. They basically say, this is what I want, this is what I believe, and they're told every vote will count, etc. So if people don't have confidence in it, then that will create problems. So what we need to do is, because I think that the allegations, at least in some counties and states, started emerging, but not because Trump was trying to bring attention to it, but because people in those various counties, like I think there was something in Arizona, and this is before he was president, so we're going back to the early 2010s, that there were things going on, and apparently the states themselves hadn't changed anything, and so people were feeling like their vote doesn't matter. And I think this is important regardless of what party you're in, regardless of what you want to vote for. So yeah, I think that if they're going through and they're finding that, hey, this isn't suspicious or this is suspicious, then that's all we could ask for, right? Because we just want to make sure that our system works. And it can be irresponsible to just make claims without, backing it up with evidence. So you should be, cautious about what it is that you try to make a claim about. I did a video on my other channel, the one I normally work for at Honey Badger Radio, and we looked at a clip from Kyle Rittenhouse's trial. And I think this speaks to the issue, because part of what's going on with the part of the problem from this whole voter fraud thing, it's also related to our trust in the media, because we do have mixed messaging coming from the media. Some of the mainstream media says that, there is no fraud going on. Some of the media says that there's some fraud going on and we should probably look into it. And then a lot of the independent media is claiming, either the extreme end of one argument, which is like there's absolutely no fraud and it's totally safe and, fair and clean. And the other side that's saying it's rampant and it's everywhere. And the only reason why this is even a problem is because we have such a low trust in our media. Because I think that if they were trying as hard as they could to be as objective as they could, then more people would have confidence in them. And then there'd probably be less of the problems that come out when people become demoralized about elections, about the future of their country, about their community, etc. And this is also being reflected in the Kyle Rittenhouse case. And so I just want to say briefly about that is that there are competing narratives. And I think that both of them, to some degree, are wrong. One is more wrong than the other, but I think they both have flaws. And just looking at the clip that we saw of Kyle Rittenhouse attempting to recount the events that occurred the night that he was forced to shoot those men who were assaulting him, and the way that he lost emotional control. So he was basically doing, I don't know if you saw the clip. Did you see the clip?
It's a startling clip, right? He has sort of a panic attack in trying to recount it. He loses control of his breath, and they break, and then he continues his testimony.
Yes. So he hyperventilates, he weeps, he breaks down. He's doing his best to maintain composure, but the moment he had to actually describe what happened that night, it looked like he was experiencing PTSD, which is something that, that term gets thrown around, and I think that a lot of times it doesn't apply. But if you take into consideration the fact that he was a 17-year-old boy when this happened, he had probably I'm sure he's never shot anyone before. I'm fairly certain of that because, that doesn't happen very often. And he was put in a position where not only did he have to shoot someone to protect his own life, but he ended up killing 2 people in that. And I'm reminded of a lot of the letters I've read about soldiers, that have written letters from World War I and World War II, and how it felt for them to have to take the life of someone else, and how difficult that is. And when you look at that clip, and I don't want to necessarily make just an emotional appeal here regarding Kyle Rittenhouse, but I think that seeing him lose his composure and break down when he's trying to testify, it tells you 2 things. Number one, the framing of him as someone who simply went to Kenosha, Wisconsin because he wanted to hunt and kill people that, were there for no reason other than his own pleasure is obviously ludicrous. It's at the very least, it's not as simple as that. The trial's still ongoing, so I don't want to presume, guilt or innocence, but that's irrelevant. I think that it's clearly emotional to do that. What were you going to say?
I think you're being more generous to the prosecution than I would be. The prosecution, they don't have any further evidence. The trial is a travesty. He never should have been brought to trial. His self-defense claim is unrefuted and 100% clear. He has no doubt post-traumatic stress, not only from the events of that night, but also the lies and demonization that have occurred throughout the media against him. And it is startling to see. Now that the prosecution case has been aired in court, it's startling to see both so many in the media and certainly so many prominent people on social media who are just unwilling to correct their prior assumption based on the facts as they've come out in court.
Yes, absolutely. And on the other side, it's a little bit of a nitpick, I guess, not really a refutation of what's being said, but people are calling Kyle Rittenhouse a hero. And my only issue with that is it's a bit, I think that what he went up there to do, he was very well intentioned. He wanted to help protect the property of people in the community. He works up there. He's from Antioch. It's literally right on the border to Wisconsin. And he knows people there. He cared about them, obviously. And he went up there to do what he thought was the right thing, right? But unfortunately, because of what was going on, he was forced into a position that I would not wish on anyone, much less a 17-year-old. And it doesn't mean that I don't think he should have gone, because it's not my choice to make. Obviously, that's what he chose to do. But I think to call him a hero might be sugarcoating everything too much, if that makes sense. It's sort of like saying that this is something worthy of celebration and praise. And what he did was the right thing, but I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to idolize it, because that's how Kyle feels, if that makes sense, right? It's like a Vietnam War veteran comes back and he had to, kill so many Viet Cong, and then we give him a medal, but that doesn't really serve that person for what they had to do. So I think that the whole thing is just really messy, and that what Kyle needs after all this is over, and this is all a bunch of stuff, like you said, that should never have happened to begin with, is he's going to need a lot of therapy, and he's going to need a lot of help. And we should give him compassion and sympathy, because this is very difficult. And simply, cheering him on, I think that it's not a terrible thing to do, but I think we should really realize what he was forced to do and how difficult that is. He's never going to be the same. Like, it literally doesn't matter if he goes to prison, which I think is still possible, because if the jury is, biased or what in some way, they could try to convict him for something. I hope that doesn't happen. I don't see why it would. But the point is, it doesn't matter if he goes to jail for life or if they set him free immediately, because he has to live with what happened for the rest of his life. And on top of that, he's probably going to be looking over his shoulder too.
I used to be a criminal defense lawyer, and being charged and going through the trial process is torture. It's torture. It ruins people's lives. They are scarred for long into the future. He has had a tremendous amount of damage done to him. And the analysis of, should he have been there? What mistakes did he make that night? Is missing this, to me, the salient point. Okay, the salient point here is the abuse of power by the pillars of our society, which are, in this case, the media and the prosecutor, who is a Democratic politician. He's run for office as a Democrat, and he has aspiration. He ran for a higher office than where he's at now. He probably has aspirations to get there again, and so he is. He's doing this for political reasons. You can see in his handling of the case, and in particular his cross-examination of Rittenhouse, that he's doing a lot of things where he's talking to the media. So, for example, he starts his cross-examination by asking, essentially, well, why didn't you tell this story before? Right? Commenting on, as the judge put it in reprimanding the prosecutor, commenting on Rittenhouse's post-arrest silence, which is a unconstitutional thing for the prosecutor to do. It's a violation of the Fifth Amendment. Everybody knows that. The prosecutor knows that. The prosecutor was intentionally violating Rittenhouse's constitutional rights there, not talking to the judge, not talking to the jury. He did that to talk to the media, because he was trying to pump a media narrative to maybe there's going to be stories in the future about, if Kyle was innocent, he should have spoken up earlier. He should have told his story earlier. Never mind the Fifth Amendment. It's really disturbing what the prosecutor's done in this case.
Yes. I don't have anything else to add, except part of the reason why there are so many people that think that Kyle Rittenhouse is in fact a psychopathic murderer is because of the way that a lot of the media reported on the story. So you have another divide right down the middle. One side thinks he's a hero, the other side thinks he's a psycho. And this is not sustainable. Like, every time anything happens in the news that can be turned into a political tug of war, it gets turned into one by the media. That's where that comes from. I think that because, like, if I work part-time as a substitute teacher, and I talk with other instructors. I also, because they're in my community, which is a little bit on the tighter knit side, we sit down, we have conversations about what's going on in the world. And what I've noticed is that if I can sit down with another person and we're talking about something that can be contentious, like the Kyle Rittenhouse case, for example, as long as, like, they're willing to listen and talk and give me their point of view and I'm willing to listen to them, we can usually work it out without a problem. But that's only if we could actually sit down, preferably in person, look each other in the eye and pass these, communicate these ideas. And the way the media operates is that they count on people not talking to other people. They assume that everything that they say must be seen as the truth, and it is above questioning. And anyone who does question it, well, you're a terrorist, you're a white supremacist, you're a misogynist, you're a label. Here's the label that you get for not obeying us and agreeing with us.
Yes, the shaming language of control, right? That is the standard thing. And it preys on this comes to bear a lot with male disposability, because one of the consequences of male disposability is that if they can find a molecule of blame, then that'll be enough to justify, oh yeah, that dude belongs in the trash bin, right? It requires so little evidence.
Yep, you can look at. You can look at the Kyle Rittenhouse, the situation as it happened, because we talked a little bit about it on the show. What happened with Kyle Rittenhouse and the people that he had to kill is a product of that male disposability. Kyle chose to go and protect property, which means that he knew on some level, he had probably hoped not, but he knew on some level that he was taking a risk. And he was going there to help people, and he was armed, but it doesn't mean that he couldn't have died. In fact, and I said this yesterday, if Kyle was murdered by Grosskreutz or Rosenbaum, we wouldn't know his name. It wouldn't have made the news. The media wouldn't have talked about it. There might have been a trial. There may have been arrest, but we would never learn anything about the event.
It would not be part of the narrative, because, come on, don't you know these protests are mostly peaceful? That would be an aberration. That wouldn't be the headline.
Because the fact is, there were deaths in 2020 as a result of riots and looting and violent protest, which I think 24 people were killed, and you'd have to do a lot of digging to find out any of their names. And so that, on the one hand, there is that. Now, on the other hand, and it's going to sound like I'm a little sympathetic here, but I think it's worth pointing out, I have talked a lot about how groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter are using male disposability as the tip of the spear, as it were. So they use men, and in particular, they're using young men or men that are looking to, prove themselves by belonging to some group.
Wind them up, being like, you know how you can achieve some value here? Okay, now off you go.
Yep, you got to go kill the fascists. And that, and that's what they do. Like, and interestingly enough, a lot of these organizations, like Antifa groups. So Antifa is like a blanket term, but there's several sub organizations that have their own individual names. Like there could be, Portland Against Fascism or something, for example. But they're all under the same umbrella as Antifa and the Black Bloc. And what I've noticed is a lot of those organizations are actually led by women. And a disproportionate number of the women who lead those organizations also happen to work in education. And so but what the most interesting part is the women who tend to run these things. And if you find footage of Black Lives Matter activists that are more of the part of the organization, not necessarily people who simply agree with the sentiment. This is another Mott and Bailey tactic that's used by, these organizations. So you have people who just believe that Black Lives Matter. Well, that's like everybody. And then you have people who are part of these organizations, which are led by people who have admitted on camera that they are, Marxist, that they operate within a certain political frame, that they have certain goals. And not one of which is that they disrupt the nuclear family because they think that it's a part of the oppressive patriarchy which upholds white supremacy, right? And it's all rhetoric, but how it works really well is you have these educated, politically driven women that form these coalitions, and there are young men who are directionless, who are purposelessness, or they're experiencing purposelessness. They're looking for a place where they belong, and they will join up with these Antifa groups. And I've also talked about how most of the time these people don't actually understand what it is they're joining. They don't necessarily agree with their politics. They just know that it's a place to belong. And I can give you an example of that. There was a gentleman that was interviewed for a podcast called Incel, which was hosted by Nama Cates, where she talks to incels and various other experts around this sort of subculture. And many of them, because the problem with incels is often talked about as though they are lonely and they desire sex, but it's not really what they're after. Most of the time, incels are just completely isolated from everyone. And so they feel like because they have a sex drive, they feel like they desire a partner, a woman, but what they really want is for someone to show them affection. Right?
It is amazing what a powerful drug a little bit of validation from a woman is for a man that is lacking that. It is amazing.
It is.
It can make the man do anything.
It is absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And so there are a number of incels that have joined various extremist groups because they wanted to feel like they belong to something. And there was one guy who was part of a white supremacist group and a communist group and an Islamist terrorist group. And he couldn't possibly believe in all of their ideologies because many of them conflict.
Right, sounds like a Chappelle Show skit.
Yeah, it does. But he was doing it because they all were looking to recruit, and he wanted to be a part of something. So if you don't, this is the reason why all this is happening is partly because there are men who are being neglected, that are being marginalized, that are not being seen as fully human, and they find themselves looking for a place to belong. Now, I think that Kyle has a place. That's why he felt like he wanted to protect the property. So it demonstrates two different kinds of male disposability, because to some degree, male disposability will always exist in our culture, because women we've just generally value them too much, and they generally won't make themselves disposable most of the time. So someone has to do it, and so men will usually do it. But the difference is that in Kyle's case, he wanted to help his neighbors. He wanted to protect their property. He wanted to make sure that people didn't get hurt. And so he chose to do it. Nobody coerced him. He didn't get pushed into it. He wanted to do it. So he elected to go and do that. Whereas in the case of guys like Rosenbaum and Grosskreutz, I don't know if I'm butchering that. They're a part of an organization, and the organization was essentially insisting that anyone who comes to oppose what they're doing, the arson and the looting and the violence, well, they must be the enemy, and so they should be taken down. And so you should use your male disposability to ensure that we achieve our goals. And again, Grosskreutz, I think he's the guy who was killed, right? There was Huber, Grosskreutz, and Rosenbaum. I know Rosenbaum was killed, but I can't remember the other guy. But nonetheless, all three of them, they seem to have sketchy criminal histories. And so I'm not forgiving them for that, because I will hold everyone to the same standard. But I will say that they didn't have to die. Like none of that had to happen. And you know, I mean, but here we are. This is reality. But the truth is that there were people using men as human shields to accomplish political goals. And this is how every war that we've ever fought, you know, is premised on. And so we have to recognize that, right? And the same thing goes for how do we get like the America to start a war in the Middle East that goes on for 20 years and we get nothing out of it. You basically convince American voters that it would be the right thing to do to send a bunch of young men into the Middle East, into Vietnam, into North Korea, into whatever country you want. And then we're going to fight a, honorable and noble war. And again, I'm not going to even speak along party lines because it doesn't matter. And these men will willingly throw themselves into the meat grinder because they think they're doing what's right. And we have to be able to value male lives enough to be able to say this war is not worth it, or this goal is not worth all of this death.
So I think that there's various forms of male disposability. Okay, so here you've been talking about disposability in war, right? And male disposability takes different forms in different eras, right? In times of war, it is obviously go die on the front. In times of poverty, it is body-breaking labor. Now, we're in this blessed time where we're in the most peaceful period there's ever been. Our technology has gotten to the point where we don't need to tolerate as severe of body-breaking labor as once we did. And so male disposability has been repackaged and has been poured into another form for this time. And that new form is male privilege. And so if you think about the Vietnam draft ended in 1973. How long does it take society to forget about it? Turns out 30 years. Because 30 years later, in early 2000s, the concept of male privilege starts coming into the lexicon. It would have been pretty silly to talk about male privilege when guys were being drafted and coming back home in body bags. But now that that's over, it's kind of moved out of memory. Now it's time to redefine history and say, well, men were privileged all throughout time and they were the oppressors. And so now men are dealing with, okay, disposability is now taking the form of privilege, this privilege claim, and men are needing to sort of process that new information, learn how to move differently. It doesn't appear, certainly from trend, that this is going to go away or reverse. If anything, the evidence seems to say that it's going to get more intense. But that doesn't mean that men can't learn to adjust how they approach the world and thrive in this new environment. So we talked a moment ago about how powerful some female validation can be to motivate a man to do something, right? It's like a spiritual need that men sort of have and can unlearn.
Yeah,
there's so talking about a similar topic, Glenn Lowry recently gave a throwback to something from Sesame Street that I think encapsulates this perfectly. So on Sesame Street, there was a song, "Put Down the Ducky." Okay, you probably don't remember it, but I remember it from a kid. When he was mentioning it, I remember this from a kid, as a kid. And so Ernie is one of the Sesame Street characters, and he has his rubber ducky, and that's his security item. He just wants to hold on to the ducky, but in this bit, he wants to play the saxophone. And he can't, right? He's like, I want to play the saxophone, but I can't because I've got my ducky. And so everyone's singing to him, you got to put down the ducky if you want to play the saxophone, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we are. We're like, you know what? We have this spiritual need, but we have to learn to put it down. Right? Once we learn to put it down, then we can learn to move properly in today's world.
You gotta put down the ducky. Put down the ducky. Put down the ducky if you wanna play the saxophone.
The way that the left typically operates. And when I say the left, I don't mean Democrats and I don't mean liberals. I think the left is a separate animal completely. Maybe we could talk about that another time. But the left is all about using whatever the most sore and tender spot is in a country's history as a weapon against that country to create division and to give themselves power and money. So in Canada, for example, they don't use race in the same way they do in America. In America, they do it based on America's, the 1800s and slavery and black people and Jim Crow, and those are the buttons they push, right? And in Canada, they do it with natives because if we didn't have a history with slavery like Canada didn't, then it would have been a native thing here too. They just made it about you stole the land, etc. Right? In the UK, it has a different focus. It's on immigration. It's on Brexit, but or it's on colonialism because the British Empire was everywhere, right? And so it's all about trying to find the sore spot in a country's history. By the way, patriarchy goes along with all of those things. So because there have always been women. And so we can always make the claim that this country, is patriarchal and it's ruled by men for the benefit of men at the expense of women. In all of these narratives, you can do that. But what's funny is that in order for these to work, it would have to be something that we all regret or that we all feel should never have happened. So you actually have to make an appeal to something that doesn't exist. You'd have to appeal to the notion that, in the case of the United States, it's a white supremacist patriarchy, right? That's exploitative and capitalistic in an evil way, etc. But in order for any of those claims to work, you would have to be arguing or telling this to people who don't feel like they who don't want to be racist, who aren't sexist, who love women, right? Because that's the only way you can get them to change. So it literally appeals to the thing that doesn't exist in order for it to gain more power and traction. But if you put aside all of the issues that I think are just distractions dealing with racial politics or LGBTQ rights or even women's rights and all of that, what you see is at the root of all of that, at the root of all of it, is the relationship between men and women. And if the relationship between men and women has a massive chasm, which it kind of does, and it's growing, this is why we have more and more men that just want to live as bachelors and more women who are waiting to get married or, don't ever get married, or they just have, a bunch of kids, or they don't have any. It actually contributes to the problem, because when women don't have men in their lives, then they seek out men in the state. And the state is more than happy to replace the men in women's lives with themselves. Meanwhile, men, whether they're looking to be married or whether they want to go full on men going their own way style and completely divorce themselves, it's irrelevant, because women will get their security, which is what they tend to vote for, from the state, and the state will give them that security at the expense of men, because men make up the majority of taxpayers and women take out the majority of tax money. And so if you fix the chasm between men and women, then women find that and again, this is all assuming that everyone chooses this, but I think most people want to be in a marriage with children. That's just the way it is. It's not a tradcon position. It's just the way people are, what were you going to say?
As you're saying, so we live in both very interesting political times and very interesting cultural times, right? And if you look demographically, men and women are drifting apart. Okay, the marriage rates have collapsed at a rate that, especially in the last decade, at a rate that people are not really coming to grips with how much they've collapsed. And so naturally, people are learning to build lives and move through the world in a way that is commensurate with how people are living in today's society, and it's easy to say, hey, people should get married, or why don't people just get married, right? But to me, I'm for freedom, and I see that demographic trend as the result of millions and millions of people making what they consider the best choice for their lives. So it's a fascinating cultural time. I think that we should keep our minds open, keep it loose. We don't know what's coming.
I'm not being prescriptive.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that people should get married or should start families, but I do think that there is a lot of cultural messaging, especially at women, saying, oh, you don't need kids, you don't need a husband, you don't need family. And so they try to listen to that. And then, there's tons and tons of blogs of women who have hit their 30s, who have hit their 40s, and they're like, oh, I wish I had just settled down, and I can't do that now. And I wouldn't tell people how they should live their lives. I'm all about freedom too, 100%. But I think that if people were really honest with themselves, I wouldn't be shocked if the overwhelming majority of women and men wanted to just start a family. And the reason why there is all this drifting apart is a lot of the cultural upheaval. It's a lot of the messaging. It's a lot of education. It's not just women making free choices with all of the most useful information. And it's not only men making those choices, but then there's a lot of stuff going on too. So you have like these really high divorce rates. And so that makes men think, well, I don't think that's worth it because the risk is too high. There are all these problems with the family court system and child custody laws, et cetera. And all of these things make things harder for people to, work out like whether or not they want to have a family and whether or not that's something they want to pursue. So what I'm trying to get at is that and I'm not making an argument for traditionalism, and I'm not making a prescriptive statement. But if I look at how things were in the West before all of this kind of all this cultural upheaval, everything from the second wave feminist movement on up to today, it seemed to me that people were more secure from their family unit. So like, a woman got her security from her man, and the man was more than willing to do the work, but being like a supporter, protector, and provider, which is something that men in general want to do, just like women in general want to, have families. And so when the state gets involved in that and breaks it up, you will get over time, especially because the media is in bed with them. The state educates our children and all these other things that people will. It may even appear to be an organic move away, but when you're like 80 years old or 85 and you're on your deathbed and there's no one there to visit you because you didn't have a family, you're going to have tremendous regret. So I wouldn't tell people how they should live their lives, but I don't think we should pretend as though not choosing to have a family is the most educated position you could take, especially because I understand the reasons why you wouldn't want it. But I think a lot of people, they don't really think these things through, if that makes sense.
Well, this is a huge topic. I'm sure that we'll talk about it more in the future. We've done an hour 10. Thank you so much. This has been great, as always.
All right.
And let's talk again soon, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I like these conversations.
Thanks for watching. You can download the Roil app at your app store by searching for Roil Mobile or Roil Technology, or you can sign up at roil.com. We'll see you there.